There's a common idea that morality is tied to religion, that people need faith to be good, that without divine rules, people would lie, steal, cheat, or kill. But if you take a closer look at how people actually behave, what they do rather than what they say, this idea starts to fall apart. And that's where things get interesting, because morality isn't just about belief, it's about choices. It's about how you treat others when no one's watching. It's about how you respond to power, pain, and truth. There's this quiet assumption, passed down over time, that religion owns the rights to morality, that without sacred texts or gods to obey, morality wouldn't exist. But that's not how ethics works. People aren't moral because they're told to be. They're moral because they care, because they think, because they understand harm. And strangely enough, when you remove the threat of divine punishment or the hope of reward, those reasons become even clearer. Studies from around the world have shown something that challenges the old view. Countries with the lowest rates of religious belief, places like Sweden, Denmark, Japan, the Netherlands, also have some of the lowest crime rates, the highest levels of life satisfaction, and some of the most generous social systems. These aren't places where people stopped being moral. They're places where people started taking responsibility for morality without needing a religious structure to enforce it. On the other hand, some of the most religious countries, especially those where religion plays a heavy role in politics and law, have higher levels of inequality, corruption, violence, and intolerance. And even within countries like the United States, studies have found that more secular states tend to have lower rates of teen pregnancy, lower divorce rates, and higher levels of education and income. This doesn't mean religious people are immoral, but it does mean that belief in a God doesn't guarantee moral behavior, and it goes deeper than statistics. Think about the types of moral reasoning that religion often encourages. In many traditions, morality is about obedience, following rules that were written down long ago, no matter how much the world has changed. There's little room for questioning or for updating your views based on new information. If something was labeled sinful 1,000 years ago, it often still is today, even if the harm once associated with it no longer exists. That's not morality, that's dogma. Now compare that with someone who doesn't rely on religion. Their sense of right and wrong has to be built from the ground up. They can't just point to a scripture and say, because it says so. They have to think, they have to weigh harm, they have to ask, what's the effect of my actions on others? That creates a kind of ethical awareness that isn't automatic. It's earned, it's reflective, and often it's more consistent. Take compassion, for example. A person might donate to a charity not because they're trying to please a higher power, but because they recognize another person's suffering. They connect on a human level, and they know that doing good has value in itself, not because someone's keeping score, but because it makes the world less painful. That kind of goodness tends to run deeper. It doesn't fade when no one's watching. It doesn't disappear when the rules change. There's also the problem of selective morality in religious frameworks. Some religious people are extremely kind, generous, and just, but others can be cruel, not in spite of their beliefs, but because of them. History is full of examples: wars fought in God's name, laws that punish love or freedom, rituals that cause harm. And these aren't fringe events. They're baked into doctrines that many still follow today. When your morality comes from a source that's considered perfect, it becomes very hard to admit when it's wrong. On the other hand, secular morality is flexible. It allows for mistakes. It grows. If a practice or belief is shown to cause harm, it can be reevaluated and dropped. That's how progress happens. That's how we move past slavery, segregation, and gender inequality. Many of those changes weren't led by religious groups. They were resisted by them. And yet today, some of those same groups claim credit for moral evolution they fought against. Even the idea of forgiveness is often misunderstood in religious thinking. In some traditions, you can commit great harm and still be considered good if you ask for divine forgiveness. But morality isn't about being forgiven. It's about taking responsibility. It's about repairing what's broken. When you remove the idea of a God who can wipe the slate clean, what you're left with is real accountability, and that can make people more thoughtful about their actions. Another key difference is in how religious and non-religious people handle disagreement. Many religious systems divide the world into believers and non-believers, saved and damned, good and evil. That creates an us versus them mindset that can easily lead to tribalism and hostility. When morality is tied to belief, disagreement isn't just seen as wrong, it's seen as dangerous. But when morality is based on empathy and reason, disagreement can become an opportunity to learn. It doesn't threaten your values, it sharpens them. Also, morality in religious communities is often enforced by fear of hell, fear of judgment, fear of exclusion. But fear isn't a stable foundation for ethics. It might control behavior in the short term, but it doesn't build understanding. It doesn't teach why something is wrong. It just teaches people to hide. And that's why religious environments sometimes produce secret wrongdoing, because the focus is on appearances, not on real moral growth. Contrast that with someone who behaves well because they've thought about the consequences, they've developed empathy, they've considered other perspectives. That person doesn't need fear to stay moral. They don't need surveillance. Their values are internal. They guide themselves not because someone told them to, but because they've come to those conclusions honestly. Another area worth looking at is honesty, not just telling the truth, but living honestly. In many religious settings, people are pressured to appear a certain way, to conform, to suppress doubt, to pretend they're certain. That often leads to a split between how someone looks in public and how they actually think or behave in private. There's a difference between believing something and pretending to believe it because it's expected. And when honesty becomes dangerous, people stop being honest with themselves. That's where non-religious morality often feels more transparent. There's less need to pretend, less need to follow a script. That doesn't mean people without religion are perfect, of course not. But it means they have fewer reasons to lie to themselves. There's no reward for looking righteous. There's only the work of actually trying to be decent. That difference matters. There's also the way religion sometimes outsources morality. People get used to thinking they'll be told what's right and wrong. So, when they face complex situations that aren't covered in their sacred texts, they don't always know how to respond. But morality isn't something you can fully outsource. It requires attention, context, judgment. When people are taught to think ethically instead of just obeying, they're better prepared to deal with real-life dilemmas. And real life is complicated. You don't always have clear rules. You're forced to weigh competing values. You have to think about long-term consequences. And that's where secular morality often does better, because it trains people to think independently, not just to ask, what would God say, but what will help? What will harm? What does fairness look like here? These aren't easy questions, but they're real ones. And answering them builds stronger moral muscles than just repeating a doctrine. Think about how people raise children. If you teach a child that lying is wrong because they'll go to hell, you might get obedience. But if you explain that lying damages trust and makes life harder for everyone, you build understanding. That child will be more likely to tell the truth even when no one is watching, because they've internalized why it matters. And that's a pattern that shows up in adult life too. Morality based on empathy tends to be more stable than morality based on fear. Another piece of this is moral circle expansion. Over time, societies tend to widen the range of beings they care about, moving from family to tribe to nation to humanity as a whole, and in some cases to animals and the environment. Religion, when rigid, often resists that expansion. It draws hard lines about who's in and who's out. But secular ethics based on reason and empathy tends to allow for broader inclusion. It's easier to say, this causes harm, therefore it's wrong, than to say, this group is cursed, therefore we owe them nothing. When you stop seeing morality as a list of divine rules and start seeing it as a system for minimizing harm and increasing well-being, it opens the door to progress. You can revise your views without guilt. You can recognize when past ideas no longer fit the facts. And you can improve, not because you've sinned, but because you've learned. That's a very different model of growth. People sometimes assume that without religion, anything goes, but it's usually the opposite. People without religious constraints often take their moral choices more seriously, because they know they only get one life. They know this world is the one place where their actions matter. There's no do-over, no divine cleanup crew, just choices and consequences, and the responsibility to live in a way that doesn't make things worse for others. Even in prison studies, researchers have found that atheists and agnostics are underrepresented compared to their percentage in the general population. That doesn't mean they're inherently better, but it suggests that lack of religion doesn't make people more likely to break the law. In fact, it often goes the other way. And when people commit crimes in the name of religion, they're often justified by the idea that their cause is higher than law, that their rules matter more than harm. Morality isn't just about avoiding evil. It's about doing good, about building trust, creating fairness, and relieving suffering. You don't need a God for that. You just need a conscience and the ability to recognize that your actions affect others. The golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated, isn't religious property. It existed in multiple cultures long before modern religions took shape, and it still works, whether or not you believe in any deity. The reality is, humans evolved as social animals. We had to cooperate to survive. That meant sharing, helping, punishing cheaters, and rewarding kindness. Morality didn't drop from the sky. It came from lived experience. It came from figuring out how to live together without tearing each other apart. And we still do that today, whether or not we attach supernatural beliefs to it. Some of the most ethical people in the world are deeply secular. They devote their lives to humanitarian work, scientific research, social justice, or animal welfare. They do it not for eternal reward, but because they care, because they feel a responsibility to reduce suffering, because they see that life is fragile and short, and wasting it on cruelty or hate is a failure of the only chance we get. In many cases, religious morality is passive. People wait for guidance. They pray for answers. They focus on purity rather than impact. But ethical living requires action. It requires engagement. And when you take out the supernatural layer, you're left with something raw and real. The weight of your choices, the people they affect, and the chance to make things slightly better or slightly worse with every decision. This doesn't mean everyone who leaves religion becomes instantly moral. People are complex. But what it does mean is that religion isn't necessary for morality, and sometimes it gets in the way. It tells people that belief is more important than behavior, that dogma matters more than consequences, that being right is better than being kind. When you look closely, you start to notice that religion often shifts the focus of morality from people to doctrines. It becomes more about loyalty to an idea than compassion for a person. It becomes more about preserving tradition than reducing suffering. And when that happens, morality starts to rot from the inside. It becomes rigid, performative, disconnected from the real world. Think about how many times people have justified cruelty in the name of obedience, whether it's the mistreatment of women, discrimination against minorities, violence against outsiders, or the suppression of basic freedoms. It's often carried out not in spite of religious belief, but because of it. And these acts are done with the confidence of being morally right. That's what makes it so dangerous. When people are convinced they're backed by a higher power, it becomes very difficult to make them question themselves. In contrast, secular ethics is full of doubt. And that's a strength, not a weakness. Doubt is what allows people to stop and think, to check their bias, to change their minds. A moral system without room for doubt is just blind obedience. But doubt makes people careful. It makes them listen. And in a world as complex as ours, careful listening is far more useful than certainty. Religious morality is also frequently disconnected from proportionality. Some beliefs treat minor personal behavior, like eating certain foods or loving the wrong person, as worse than serious harm done to others. You can be kind, honest, and generous and still be seen as immoral if you break one of the sacred rules. And you can be cold, arrogant, or even cruel and still be considered righteous if you follow the rules perfectly. That kind of distortion breaks the link between morality and human well-being. A morality that's rooted in reality has to care about outcomes. It has to ask what helps and what hurts. And when you remove supernatural thinking, it becomes easier to focus on the actual effects of actions. You can ask, does this cause suffering? Does it rob someone of dignity? Does it build trust or destroy it? These are the questions that build real ethics. There's another problem that often goes unnoticed. Religious morality tends to be very interested in personal purity and less interested in collective responsibility. It's more concerned with personal sins than systemic harm. So, people might obsess over avoiding certain behaviors, but ignore larger problems like poverty, inequality, or climate damage. But real morality doesn't end with personal choices. It extends outward. It looks at how society is structured and whether it treats people fairly. In that sense, atheists and secular people often take a broader moral view. Because they don't believe that suffering will be fixed in an afterlife, they care more about fixing it here. They know this is the only world we've got. That makes injustice feel more urgent. It makes progress feel more necessary. If you don't believe a better world is waiting after death, you have more reason to make this one better while you're alive. There's also less tolerance for excuses. Without the idea that sin is built into our nature and only faith can redeem us, people take more ownership of their actions. They don't blame a devil or chalk it up to temptation. They see choices as choices, and that makes apologies mean more. It makes change more possible. You can't grow if you're always shifting the blame onto invisible forces. You also tend to see more moral humility, because when you don't believe in absolute truth handed down from a God, you're more open to learning, more open to being wrong, and that's crucial. So many moral failings throughout history have come from the belief that one group has all the answers and everyone else is lost. That belief makes cruelty easier. It turns correction into punishment. But when you admit that you're still figuring things out, you become more generous with others, more compassionate, more open. Another key difference is how atheists often see morality as a shared human project. It's not handed down from above. It's built from the ground up, through conversation, empathy, evidence, and collaboration. That means it's something we build together, not something we obey. And that means we're responsible not just for following rules, but for making sure the rules themselves are just. And that's where the most important point comes in. When religion tells people that morality comes from God, it makes ethics untouchable. It freezes it. It becomes a list that can't be edited. But when morality comes from people, it stays alive. It grows. It can respond to new knowledge, new needs, and new perspectives. And that adaptability is what makes it more effective. If someone today tried to write a moral code from scratch, and they used modern knowledge of psychology, sociology, history, and economics, it would look nothing like the moral codes of ancient religious texts. And that's a good thing, because morality isn't about preserving the past. It's about protecting the present and shaping a better future. And in practice, many atheists live by values that are deeply moral: honesty, fairness, compassion, freedom, responsibility. Not because they're scared of punishment or chasing a reward, but because they've thought it through. They've decided that kindness matters, that truth matters, that harm matters, and they act accordingly. Religious people often say that without a God, anything is allowed. But what we keep seeing over and over is that people without gods are often the ones thinking hardest about what should be allowed, what should be forgiven, what should be changed, and most importantly, what should be questioned. This is why, in many real and measurable ways, atheists are not less moral, but more reflective, more consistent, and often more compassionate in how they approach ethics. Not because they're better people, but because their morality isn't based on obedience. It's based on empathy. And that, more than belief, is what holds the world together. Thanks for staying with me through this deep dive. If you found the ideas in this video thought-provoking, consider subscribing for more honest conversations about belief, reason, and the world we share. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment and let's keep the discussion going.